The book of Proverbs purposefully repeats certain themes over and over again. And that's meant to provoke our minds to think about certain truths from different angles, to consider the various ways that wisdom and folly manifest themselves in everyday life. So we're presented with interesting and sometimes humorous characterizations of drunkards, fools, and brawlers as a way to alert us on who to avoid, who to befriend, and who to rebuke and correct. So if we take note of these characters, we'll be better equipped to navigate social situations with skill and prudence. So there's a homespun kind of wisdom that gets to the heart of how things work in the world, that forces us to peer deeper into the habits and routines of life to unearth hidden wisdom. And if we want wisdom, we need to pay attention not only to God's word, but God's world. This is Understanding Proverbs. We're going to look at chapters 25 to 27 of the book of Proverbs. We're going to start in 25 with the first 7 verses dealing with the glory of kings. This section paints a portrait of the wise king who represents the righteous reign of God over Israel. God conceals wisdom so that only the wise and diligent kings find it. The hiddenness of wisdom screens out foolish kings and allows the cream to rise to the top. Verse 2. A king's might rests not in the strength of his military or the wealth of his treasury, but rather a heart formed by God's wisdom. That's really key. The height and depths of his wisdom make his mind seem unsearchable. It's beyond the ordinary intellect of people. He's risen to such a level of insight that he almost serves as a human analogy of God's unsearchable intellect. Verse 3. So a wise king's rule is going to result in justice, righteousness. The dross of wicked men gets burnt away, removed from the land, so that only the silver of righteousness remains. Verses 4 to 5. The wise king also creates a culture in which people entrust themselves to his wise rule. So Christ in the Gospels tells his disciples not to seek the seat of honor, but rather let the host of the feast elevate you by saying, move up. In other words, you're not supposed to put forth yourself in a vainglorious way, but rather in humility allow the one who is at the head of the table to raise you up. And that's an analogy to the way that God works. God opposes the proud, but he lifts up the humble. 25, 6 to 7 of Proverbs presents a similar ethic. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence, or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. So it's socially prudent to let others promote you, rather than seek to make yourself the center of attention. So humility actually has some practical import as well as spiritual. We look at verses 8 to 17 of chapter 25, which deals with the topic of fitting words. Once again, how we use our words takes center stage in the book of Proverbs. And there's a particular emphasis on appropriate timing. You may hastily take your brother to court based upon a perceived slight, and then find yourself embarrassed when the judge rules against you. It's far better to talk to your brother in private. That way you can talk things through and avoid further escalation and public shame. Why not just speak to your brother and not get all the legal authorities involved? The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about this. Why are you suing one another in the church? Why not handle your disputes interpersonally and let the bond of the Spirit of love help ease some of these tensions and bring about reconciliation? It's just a poor witness if you have to have people outside the church settle all of your disputes. It's also prudent to step back from the situation to consider the merits of your case. When you're caught up in the heat of offense, you're more likely to exaggerate things or miss details or perhaps overstate your case. You don't want things to be out of proportion, which leads only to further damage. Again, words are a wonderful tool, as Proverbs tells us, in turning away wrath, in settling down a situation and not letting things escalate to where there's a greater potential for harm to all parties. And just as an apple of gold seems appropriate on a plate of silver, so also a wise man's words fit the situation he addresses. He offers correction by choosing and timing his words correctly. The wise listener is the one who heeds those words and receives them as he would a gold ring or an ornament, as a gift, verses 11 to 12. There's a fittingness to how we speak. It's not just the content, but the context. And we also are reliant upon the person who's listening to our correction to be receptive, to view what we're giving to them as something of genuine value. So a faithful messenger is somebody who refreshes those who hear the truth from their mouth. He refreshes like cold snow does on a hot summer day, verse 13. By contrast, the boastful man uses his mouth not to deliver the truth, but to be deceptive. He gives a message of generosity, but he never follows through with action. He's like an approaching cloud that promises water to nourish the land, but it never rains. Verse 14. He speaks without thinking, and that reveals a lack of self-mastery over his tongue. A man who can exercise self-control over his words through patience and through prudence is going to be able to persuade rulers to a greater effect than somebody who just says what's on his mind. Prudent speech is a powerful tool for persuasion and for influence. A soft word which de-escalates and puts others at ease actually serves as a source of strength rather than weakness. Verse 15. Just because somebody speaks gently doesn't mean they have no power. In fact, the ability to master your tongue and to use it for a precise objective, to speak truthfully, forthrightly, but also persuasively, is an incredible source of influence and power. The wise know that they can have too much of a good thing. Honey, though sweet, gets vomited out when we overindulge. Verse 16. So we need to know our limits, and we need to know the boundaries of other people as well. We need to get the hint, so to speak, when we've overstayed our welcome or abused a neighbor's hospitality by visiting too often. Verse 17. In short, wise words and actions come when we consider God and others and seek to act in light of these considerations. And this extends to all of society in verses 18 to 28. In this section, we learn about slander and the way that slander and backbiting and strife caused by words can destroy an entire community. Slander weaponizes words like swords and arrows, and that disrupts the communal trust that you need for a society to thrive. Verse 18. A society without mutual trust is going to allow treacherous men to abuse others. Verse 19. People who lack concern for their neighbor are going to act in ways out of harmony with their situation. They're going to do the exact opposite thing that their neighbor needs. They're going to sing happy songs when they should be grieving with their neighbor. They're going to take away his coat in the middle of a snowstorm. Verse 20. So there's this idea that for a community to function well, people have to look out for the interests of one another, not just for themselves. And when that deteriorates, everything else falls with that. So we should seek the good not only of our neighbors, but even shockingly, our rivals and our enemies, giving them food and water to drink. Now, this act of mercy not only brings a blessing from God, but if it is received poorly by the person that we show mercy to, it actually becomes a judgment on them, becomes burning coals heaped upon the heads of the wicked. So kindness to someone who offends you demonstrates trust that God is going to settle all accounts in the end. You don't need to worry about whether you're defrauded or whether they appreciate what you've done. God's going to hold them to account. And that is what allows us to be generous even to our enemies in the present. We don't always need to take things into our own hands because God is going to deal with that for us. Verses 21 to 22. A lack of mercy in society creates backbiting tongues and strife. And that extends to the home. If you have a household devoid of mercy, it becomes filled with contention. The constant quarrels of a wife make a rooftop exposed to the bitter elements more hospitable than a home for a husband. Verses 23 to 24. That's how bad conflict can turn things awry inside of a household. The presence of a righteous person brings life and light to a community. But when he becomes corrupt, everyone else suffers. So he's got to take care not to give way either to his own sin or to the sins of others. He has to maintain his integrity, and that comes only if he possesses both humility and self-mastery. Humility frees him from the shackles of self-glory so that he's able to serve others with strength and courage. And his self-mastery allows him to maintain his cool under pressure, refusing to allow enemies to infiltrate his mind and to turn his heart toward evil, either through rash decisions or reactivity or falling into any kind of temptation. Verses 25 to 28. Then the beginning of verse 26 opens up another portrait of the fool. In fact, there's multiple portraits here. We see the fool in verses 1 to 12, the sluggard in 13 to 16, the brawler or quarrelsome man in 17 to 22, and then the hypocrite in 23 to 28. So let's work through each of these classes of people, these types of people. A foolish man with honor is as out of place as snow in the summer, verse 1. He's beast-like in his nature. He lacks sense and rationality, so he needs to be prodded externally like a whip to a horse or a bridle to a donkey, verse 3. He's not self-motivated. Therefore, wise men need to act prudently around these kinds of people, around fools. If correcting a fool just gets you enmeshed in his folly, stay away. If correcting him is just going to escalate the situation and cause harm to you, don't argue with him. But if you need to make an example, or if you feel like you can actually seek to do good to him in correcting, then by all means, show his folly, expose his stupidity. But our ability to observe the nuances of different circumstances is what enables us to act effectively. Again, it's important to be able to register what's going on here. What are the relational and social dynamics? How can I play this out in my head so that I can discern whether it's right to correct the person right now or to just let it lie and not deal with the situation because it's just going to make things worse? Both honor and wisdom prove useless to a fool. And that's because his senses are dulled, much like a drunk man feels no pain when a thorn goes right through his hand, verses 6 to 9. So those who appoint fools or drunkards into positions of authority or responsibility, it's like they're shooting arrows into the community. They're harming everybody around them, verse 10. And the fool is going to constantly repeat his folly. He's like a dog returning to his vomit over and over again because he's fundamentally self-deceived. Why would you want to go back to your vomit unless you have a very distorted vision of reality? And the reason his vision of reality is distorted is because he's proud. He's wise in his own eyes and therefore lacks any capacity to receive criticism and feedback or any desire to change his ways. Verses 11 to 12. Second portrait, the sluggard, verses 13 to 16. The sluggard once again points to a lion in the streets as an excuse for his laziness. He rests in his bed like a door rests on hinges. He's completely useless to those around him. And he's too lazy even to meet his own needs, much less the needs of others. There's this comical image of him putting his hand into a dish of food, but he's got no strength or no will to actually bring it to his mouth. He's so lazy that he won't even provide for himself on the basic nourishments of life. And he does this because he's convinced of his own folly. He's wise in his own eyes, more than 7 men who can answer sensibly. He's always got a reasonable excuse for not applying himself. There's no reasoning with him because he is utterly convinced that he's not doing anything wrong, and you really can't do much with a person like that. The third portrait, the quarreler or the brawler, verses 17 to 22. The quarreler, on the other hand, he does apply himself, but he does so in the absolute wrong direction, right? He's applying himself diligently to meddling in the affairs of other people. He recklessly throws out words like firebrands and arrows, and he uses humor to deceive his neighbor. He's the kind of person who expresses evil under the guise of sarcasm or joking. He says something terrible or insults someone and says, I was just joking. You're being too sensitive. He's the kind of guy that gets bad service at every restaurant he goes to, right? And when you remove him, the conflict is removed as well. He's the wood that kindles the fire of conflict. When you remove the wood, the fire diminishes. It goes away. So the wise must guard themselves against enticing these kinds of people. And the primary way that you can guard yourself from allowing these people to inflame a community or a group of friends or a family is not to eat the delicious morsels of gossip that they present to you. It's to take care not to let gossip spread, not let that fire of recklessness engulf an entire community. So it's got to start with you. You're probably not going to convince them to stop quarreling, to stop using humor to mask their evil intentions. You're probably not going to be able to stop them from gossiping, but you can stop the spread of gossip by not allowing yourself to indulge in your appetite to hear forbidden information, to hear slander or gossip about others. Finally, the hypocrite, verses 23 to 28. The wicked man proclaims one thing but practices another. Okay, that's the definition of hypocrisy. So here we see that in verse 23, his fervent words mask an evil heart. So he says, oh, he's full of love for you, but he actually hates you. And the more animated he is about his love for you, the more he actually is masking his hatred. Verses 24 to 25 show that he may outwardly appear kind and generous, but his deceptive words hide a heart of malice and hatred. So take care not to fall into the trap of these kinds of people. Verse 26 shows us that his sin's going to catch up to him, and the subsequent judgment will be both swift and public. He's the architect of his own destruction. He rolls the stone up the hill only to find it crashing back down on him in verse 27. In other words, a man who weaves a web of lies and deceit is going to find it increasingly difficult to keep his story straight, and eventually his web is going to collapse upon himself. He's going to fall into the pit that he dug for himself by his deceptive and destructive ways. And at the core, the hypocrite and liar hates other people. But he hates them in a way that masks his true intentions. And one of the favorite tools that he has is flattery. Flattery is his primary means of bringing others to ruin. He creates a false sense of security for his victims, and then he devours them when they least expect it. Verse 28. Now, in order to avoid this path, you've got to fear God. And that's the beginning of verse 27. The first 10 verses is about how fear of God translates to our everyday life. The wise man who fears God recognizes first that he's not in control of anything. He can't boast about tomorrow. He's not a fool. He's not presumptive upon God, but recognizes that God is the master of his fate. And so instead of heaping praise upon himself, he lets others do the talking, even strangers who are going to give an unbiased opinion. Somebody who doesn't know you or isn't on your payroll or isn't biased because they're part of your family, when they say good things about you, that actually goes a long way. Verse 2. Above all, the man who fears God exercises self-mastery. We see this in verses 3 to 4. He's not triggered by the provocations of the fool or the temptations to unrighteous anger and wrath. He's even self-possessed enough not to get ensnared by jealousy, one of the most potent forces in the world. So a wise man is not afraid to say hard things to a friend out of love. Verses 5 and 6. His correction may sting like a wound, but in the end it's an expression of love. By contrast, an enemy's kiss may seem like a sign of friendship, but in the end, it's just a setup for a brutal betrayal. Think about Judas handing over Jesus to his enemies with a kiss. Again, looks can be deceiving. It may seem like that harsh word is revealing a harsh heart, but it's actually the opposite. And it may seem like that generous act or that compassionate act is revealing a compassionate heart, but it could actually be the opposite. And the hypocrite, on the outside, he's one way. On the inside, he's another. Now, those who lack fear of God are also possessed by unhealthy appetites. He's going to crave bitter things as sweet. He finds no sweetness in his home, the place of rest and warmth, and instead craves the bitterness of adulterous behavior. The man is never home. He's always wandering the streets, verses 7 to 8. So we must take care not to make friends with these kinds of people, but rather seek those who, like oil and perfume, bring gladness and joy to our lives. Such friends may prove even more trustworthy and reliable than our own family. Verses 9 to 10. Speaking of family, the father reasserts his voice into this passage, starting in verses 11 to 22 of chapter 27. Be wise, my son, and make my heart glad. Verse 11. So again, the impulse to make our fathers proud motivates godly living, and that's by design. And when we listen to godly parents, we experience the fruits of that godly wisdom. We are able to hide ourselves from danger, verse 12. Avoid foolish debts to strangers or annoying our neighbors, verses 13 to 14. And we create harmony in the home. A quarrelsome wife is going to disrupt familial unity. She has this constant drip of criticism and biting words, and she wears down a man's strength so that he can't master anything. But good friends do the opposite. Good friends strengthen a man like iron sharpens iron. Verses 15 to 17. Brotherhood matters, and a man without peers or elders to challenge him will find himself dull and unable to be all that he can be. In verse 18, the man who guards his master is like a gardener who tends to a fig tree. He's going to share in its fruit. When we seek the good of our superiors, we often receive the spoils of their success. And verse 19 shows another benefit of friendship. It allows us to see our own character from another vantage point. A good friend who stands face to face with you allows you to see things in yourself that you might be blind to. But just as the grave insatiably devours the bodies of men, so also pride gives us an unyielding desire for praise. We don't actually want to be sharpened by others because we have such an ego that we don't want to be corrected. But a man's character gets tested by how he handles praise. Is it going to reveal the gold and silver of wisdom, or is it just going to be all dross of vanity? Verses 20 to 21. Similarly, a fool's character gets revealed in that no matter how many consequences he experiences, he never departs from his folly. It's become an inseparable part of his being, verses 21 to 22. Finally, we conclude with 23 to 27 of chapter 27, with an admonition to take responsibility for one's life. This requires diligent attention to the areas that God has assigned to you. You've got to know the condition of your flock and of your herd. Get a pulse on your family. Attend to their needs. Verse 23. Crowns don't endure through the generations on their own power, and neither do riches. They need to be maintained and taken care of. And so faithfulness to those under your care means diligent attention and maintenance of your relationships and the people that depend upon you. Verse 24. But if you do this, you're going to receive back blessings greater than your investment. God designed the goats to clothe and feed our households. There's a cohesion between our labor and our provision, between our effort and our joy. And it's through taking care of our responsibilities that God takes care of us. And so Proverbs is pro God's sovereignty and pro man's responsibility. And he shows that these two are intertwined. And on a practical level, it's worth asking the question, what has God entrusted me with? Am I maintaining it? Am I stewarding it well? Am I attentive to the needs of the people under my purview? If you take care of those responsibilities, it will come back as a blessing to you. But if you neglect them, you will only suffer loss. It's the path of wisdom, the path of folly, and each step is determined by the decisions we make in everyday life.